Imagine you're driving home after a long day, minding your own business, when suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights appear in your rearview mirror. For most, it's just an inconvenience. But for some, it's a terrifying reminder of a broken system. Now, what if the person being stopped is one of the most powerful judges in the state? What unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. An encounter that starts as a routine traffic stop quickly spirals into a shocking revelation about power, prejudice, and justice. This is a real-life story you won't want to miss. If you're ready for more stories like this that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after the credits roll, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep bringing you incredible content, and we'd love to have you as part of our community. It was an unseasonably warm spring afternoon in Atlanta. The sun shimmered high in the sky, casting long shadows over the tree-lined streets. Traffic hummed as usual, with people going about their daily routines. Amidst this typical day, Judge Marcus Langston, a man of prominence, grace, and respect, was driving home from the courthouse after a long day presiding over a controversial case involving police misconduct. Langston, known for his fairness and wisdom, had been appointed to the Georgia Supreme Court a year earlier, a feat that made national headlines as he was the first black man to hold the position. He cruised in his sleek, black sedan, listening to jazz on the radio. His mind was heavy with the burden of the cases he had seen that week. His judgments had been difficult, but Langston had always prided himself on being a voice of reason. He was lost in thought when the piercing wail of a siren snapped him out of his reverie. A flashing red and blue light appeared in his rearview mirror. Marcus furrowed his brow, glancing down at his speedometer. He hadn't been speeding, nor had he broken any traffic rules. Confused, he signaled, pulled over to the side of the road, and waited as the police cruiser parked behind him. A chill crawled up his spine. Something about this stop didn't feel right. The cop swaggered over, boots hitting the pavement with deliberate, slow steps. As he neared the window, Marcus noticed the man's face, Officer Scott Harlan. The name was familiar to him. This particular officer had a reputation for being aggressive, especially toward black motorists. License and registration, Harlan demanded, his voice cold and brusque. There was no courtesy, no explanation, just a harsh demand. Marcus nodded, reaching for his wallet. His calm demeanor belied the rising discomfort in his chest. He handed over his documents, noting how Harlan didn't even glance at them before asking, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, officer, I don't," Marcus replied, his voice steady. Harlan smirked, leaning against the window frame. "Suspicious driving. I've been following you for a while." "Suspicious driving?" The phrase echoed in Marcus's mind. "Officer, I haven't violated any laws. Can you be more specific?" Harlan's face hardened. "You got a smart mouth for someone in your position. You people always think you can get away with anything." His tone dripped with condescension, and Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Harlan's statement was clear. This was not about driving. Marcus had seen this countless times from his seat on the bench: racial profiling, harassment, and injustice. But never had he been on the receiving end, at least not like this. He chose his next words carefully. "Officer, I'm complying with your requests. If there's a legitimate reason for this stop, I'd like to hear it." Harlan sneered. "Get out of the car." Marcus felt the weight of the moment. He knew the law, he knew his rights. But he also knew that Harlan wasn't interested in the law. Complying might save him from escalation, but it would be a submission to a broken system. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, towering over the officer by a few inches. "Put your hands on the hood," Harlan barked. The officer was bristling, perhaps unnerved by Marcus's confident presence. Marcus hesitated, then complied, feeling the heat of the metal through his shirt. Harlan began patting him down roughly, muttering under his breath, "Typical. Thinks he's above the law." The humiliation was suffocating, but Marcus remained calm. He'd worked his entire life for his dignity and respect, and he would not let this man strip him of it in a matter of minutes. After what felt like an eternity, Harlan stepped back, having found nothing. "What's your name?" Harlan finally asked, though he could have easily seen it from Marcus's license. "Marcus Langston," he replied. Harlan froze for a brief moment, and Marcus caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. But the officer quickly masked it, his voice now laced with annoyance. "Sit tight. Don't go anywhere." Marcus watched as Harlan stormed back to his cruiser, leaving him standing by the side of the road. He could feel the curious stares of passers-by. He was a judge, a symbol of justice, and yet here he stood, humiliated on the side of the road. Little did Officer Harlan know, his actions were about to set off a chain of events that would shake the city. Sitting back in his cruiser, Harlan ran Marcus's license. As he typed in the name, his smug expression shifted. The name Marcus Langston popped up with a flashing flag, Georgia Supreme Court Justice. Harlan's face paled. His mind raced. He hadn't expected this. He thought he was just hassling another black man. He had done it dozens of times. The traffic stops were always routine. He'd rough them up a little, throw in a warning, and send them on their way. But this was different. This man had power. But instead of backing down, Harlan's pride flared. The badge had always made him feel invincible. How could one traffic stop ruin that? Stepping back out of the cruiser, Harlan tried to compose himself. "Judge, huh? Well, you still broke the law today, driving erratically?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I didn't break any laws, officer. You and I both know that." The tension was palpable, but Marcus wasn't going to engage in a power struggle. Instead, he calmly asked, "Are you going to arrest me or issue a citation? If neither, I believe we're done here." Harlan's face flushed with frustration. How could this man stay so calm? It was unnerving. Without another word, Harlan thrust Marcus's license and registration back at him. "Get out of here," he growled. Marcus took his documents, stepped back into his car, and drove away. But the incident was far from over. The next morning, Marcus sat in his chambers, reviewing the upcoming cases. His mind still lingered on the events of the previous day. He was no stranger to racial profiling, but this time it had cut deeper. It was a reminder that no matter how high you climbed, some would always see you through the lens of your skin color. He was pulled from his thoughts when his assistant, a sharp young woman named Elise, knocked on the door and entered, her expression serious. "Judge Langston, I think you need to see this," she said, handing him her phone. On the screen was a news article, "Supreme Court Justice Pulled Over by Controversial Officer Scott Harlan." Marcus's eyes widened. How did they find out? Elise shrugged. "Someone must have seen it and reported it. It's all over social media now. People are outraged, especially given Officer Harlan's history." Marcus sat back, rubbing his temples. He had wanted to leave the incident behind, but now it seemed the story had a life of its own. As the hours passed, the story continued to grow. News outlets began covering the incident, discussing Harlan's long record of complaints for racial profiling and excessive force. The department, already under scrutiny from recent misconduct cases, was now facing public outcry. That evening, Marcus's phone rang. It was the Chief Justice. "Marcus, I've been briefed on what happened yesterday. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied. "Just frustrated. We can't ignore this. There's a spotlight on it now. I've spoken to the governor's office. They're launching an investigation into Officer Harlan and his department." Marcus sighed. He had always been a man of action, but in this moment he felt like a pawn in a larger game. He knew this investigation could have serious implications, not just for him, but for the entire justice system in Georgia. But little did he know, the outcome would be even more shocking than anyone expected. The investigation into Officer Harlan and his department unfolded quickly. Marcus Langston's encounter had become a catalyst for deeper scrutiny. A task force was formed, comprising internal affairs officers, civil rights attorneys, and independent investigators. Harlan, who had always managed to dodge consequences in the past, now found himself under a microscope. As the investigation progressed, evidence began to emerge that painted an even darker picture than Marcus could have imagined. Harlan had been involved in a network of corruption within the department, routinely targeting black and minority drivers with fabricated charges and extorting bribes in exchange for leniency. His aggressive traffic stops weren't random, they were part of a larger system of exploitation. Marcus, though reluctant to be at the center of the storm, cooperated with the investigation. He gave a formal statement recounting the events of that day, But he also used the opportunity to advocate for broader reforms in policing. He knew that his case was just one example in a sea of injustices that many Black Americans face daily. As the weeks passed, the public outcry intensified. Protesters gathered outside the police station, demanding justice for all those who had been victims of Harlan's actions. The case was no longer just about a traffic stop. It had become a symbol of the systemic racism that plagued law enforcement. Then, just as the investigation seemed to be reaching its peak, an unexpected twist occurred. Officer Harlan went missing. The city was buzzing with rumors. Some believed Harlan had fled to avoid the consequences of his actions. Others speculated that he had been silenced by those within the department who feared being implicated in the corruption. Whatever the reason, his disappearance added a new layer of mystery to the unfolding saga. Meanwhile, Marcus Langston remained focused on his work. The courts were a place of solace for him, a place where the law, though imperfect, could be wielded to create real change. He knew that the wheels of justice turned slowly, but they did turn. One afternoon, as he was preparing for a particularly challenging case, a package arrived at his office. Inside was a small, nondescript envelope with no return address. Marcus opened it cautiously, finding a single piece of paper with a cryptic message. Justice comes in many forms. Yours is yet to come. The note left him unsettled, but he chose not to share it with anyone. He had faced threats before. This wasn't entirely new. But something about the wording of the message felt different. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Weeks later, Harlan's body was found in a river on the outskirts of town. The autopsy revealed signs of foul play, but no suspects were identified. The case, much like Harlan himself, became another enigma, a dark shadow that hung over the city. As the dust settled, Marcus Langston reflected on everything that had transpired. The outcome of his traffic stop had been far more than he had anticipated. It had exposed deep-rooted corruption, sparked a movement for police reform, and ended with the death of a man who had been both a perpetrator of injustice and a victim of his own hubris. In the end, Marcus knew that justice was not always clean, nor was it always swift. But it was inevitable. Whether through the courts, the public eye, or the mysterious forces that operated beyond his understanding, justice had a way of finding those who sought to escape it. Months later, as Marcus sat in his chambers preparing for another day in court, he caught his reflection in the window. The weight of his position, his responsibility to the law and the people, felt heavier than ever. But he also saw in his reflection the strength that had carried him through the storm. He had faced down a system that had tried to reduce him to nothing more than his race. He had been stopped, humiliated, and nearly broken. But in the end he had stood firm. As he turned away from the window, ready to preside over the next case, Marcus Langston knew that justice, though flawed, was still the most powerful force in the world. And in the mirror of justice, truth would always reflect, no matter how dark the times.